Hey guys, Frenzy the Killbot here with another bonus lore video. Halo 2, as the middle entry in a trilogy, is all about fleshing out the world they introduced in Halo 1. Specifically, it's about learning more about the Covenant, who they are and why they're doing the things they do. As kind of a neat example of this, the limited collector's edition of the game actually came with an alternate information booklet that's entirely written as a Covenant dossier. Under the heading Noble Tools of Conquest, it states that the energy sword is not to be used by those of ignoble rank under any circumstances, and under primitive implements of war, that the human pistol is almost laughably weak. The whole thing is actually extremely cute. Through the game so far, we've definitely learned a lot about the Covenant, and there's still more to come in the third act, but it's kind of surface level stuff and doesn't dig too deep. In this video, I'd like to do some of that digging and give you a much better understanding of our enemy. The Covenant are a theocratic hegemony with a taxonomic caste system, which is a lot of fancy words to say it's a bunch of aliens whose ranks and roles are largely defined by their species, and are governed based on religious teachings. We've seen the prophets as the religious leaders, the elites as the military leaders, and the other species filling various combat roles. But there must be more to it than that, and it all had to start somewhere. Unsurprisingly, the beginning of the Covenant starts with their leaders, the prophets. Their home planet contained many Forerunner artifacts which they discovered early in their species' development, and which formed the basis of their beliefs. The centerpiece of this collection of relics was a giant Forerunner ship, a dreadnought, which had been abandoned on their planet. Almost 5,000 years before the events of Halo, a conflict would break out among the prophets, with a theme that we'll see repeated a number of times. Most of their people believed that the Forerunner artifacts were holy relics to be passively revered, but some began to think that maybe they were gifts from the gods, and gifts are meant to be used. Perhaps the Forerunners left these items intentionally to assist the prophets in securing their place in the galaxy. This difference in perspective would cause a war, which only ended when the minority group, the Reformists, barricaded themselves inside the Forerunner dreadnought, learned how to activate it, and left their planet to find a new life in the stars. The Forerunner ship contained a system that allowed them to track other relics, and the prophets spent 1,000 years traversing the galaxy, collecting Forerunner technology, and adapting it to their own uses. This continued until they ran across the elites. The elites' home planet was also rife with Forerunner artifacts, and it seemed at first that the two species would be united by their common reverence. But the elites were more similar to the prophets who had been left behind, and once they learned that these spacefaring prophets planned to take and actually use the relics, things became bloody fast. The elites are a stereotypical warrior culture, and as such were extremely proficient in combat. In hand-to-hand engagements, the elites could face off favorably with a contingent of prophets 10 times their numbers. However, the Forerunner dreadnought possessed extremely powerful weapons and defenses. Once the prophets brought it in as reinforcements, they could wipe out anything the elites had to throw at them. The elites were pushed to the point of desperation, and many began to realize that their only chance of survival was to adapt and use their own Forerunner artifacts to counter the dreadnought. But the prophets had come to their own realization. The Forerunner ship was their only advantage. What if the next species they met was more powerful than the elites, or possessed their own Forerunner tech and were willing to use it? And so the prophets offered the elites a truce, a potential partnership. If the elites agreed to be their protectors, then the prophets would minimize their exploitation of Forerunner relics and treat them with more reverence and respect. They would also share everything that they had learned about their gods, and everything they were trying to discover about their fate. This truce would become the foundation for the Covenant and their shared religion based on discovering the method of the Forerunners' ascension and the means to follow in their footsteps. A goal that they would come to call walking the path on the way to the great journey. Along with their beliefs, the prophets and the elites also shared a bit of a flair for the dramatic, and so their agreement was memorialized in a poem known as the Writ of Union, which reads, "So full of hate were our eyes that none of us could see. Our war would yield countless dead, but never victory. So let us cast arms aside, and like discard our wrath. Thou in faith will keep us safe whilst we find the path. With the elite's ships serving as the Covenant fleet, the Forerunner dreadnought was retired, and much like it was on the Prophet's homeworld, would become the centerpiece of their collection, the heart of their new holy city, High Charity. This fledgling empire would continue the Prophet's previous mission of tracking down Forerunner artifacts, but now mostly studying them rather than adapting them to be used. The first other race the Covenant encountered were the Hunters. In their singular state, the Hunters are large, bright orange worms who subsist by eating rocks and even metal. More specifically, they can actually ingest the metal that the Forerunners used in construction. When the Covenant discovered that the worms had literally devoured entire Forerunner facilities, they were furious. They labeled the Hunters as blasphemers and set about trying to eradicate them. But the Covenant had underestimated their intelligence and abilities. When necessary, the Hunters can group together into a large, hive-minded creature and alter their shape to inhabit and operate machinery, like the armored suits that we're used to seeing them in. They were such a difficult enemy that the Covenant hierarchs enlisted an Arbiter to lead the fight. This Arbiter set about learning what they could about their enemy. He realized that some of the worm colonies did not eat the Forerunner material, and in fact worked around the structures, excavating them. He reported back to the Prophets that with this new information and the Hunters' newly exhibited intelligence, perhaps they could be tamed instead, made to realize that it was the destruction of the Forerunner relics that they were angry at. Their excavation and combat skills would surely come in handy in the future. While communication was difficult, eventually another truce was offered. If the Hunters joined the Covenant and made themselves useful, they would be forgiven for their previous ignorant heresy. The Hunters, realizing they would likely lose an extended conflict, agreed. Despite being one of the oldest members of the Covenant, they are one of the least pious, mostly just completing whatever tasks that are assigned to them, but otherwise being content to be left alone. A couple thousand years later, the Covenant would run into the drones. As the name implies, they are an insectoid species with a hive mentality, similar to bees. These insects were very evolved and had developed extreme technological prowess and were excellent mechanics. They actually had a large fleet of capable spacecraft. The drones' fleet immediately engaged the Covenant at first contact, and while the Covenant had superior technology, the drones had sheer numbers. Since their ships were crewed by, well, drones, they had no problem sacrificing a large number of them in their attacks. They swarmed the Covenant fleet and actually forced them to retreat. Having recognized the benefits of recruiting capable species, the Covenant began attempting communication, from a safe distance of course. The drone's intelligence was centered in its queens, and once they began talks with the Prophets, they realized the benefits of joining. Like the Hunters, they didn't really care about the religious aspects of the Covenant, but were interested in the opportunities for expansion that joining this empire would give them. And so the drones would fill out the Covenant's ranks as disposable combat troops, and would also act as mechanics to keep their fleet in working order. The next race to join the Covenant were the Jackals. They had mastered local space travel and colonized much of the asteroid belt that surrounded their home planet. They were not as unified as the Hunters or the drones before them, though. They were actually quite similar to the humans during the Interplanetary War. Multiple factions engaging in small-scale battles with each other. And also piracy. The Jackals really like piracy. When a Covenant scouting party arrived in their system, the Jackals' first instinct was to attack them and try to take their stuff. The Covenant didn't take kindly to this, and quickly called reinforcements to retaliate, sparking a full conflict. The Covenant were much more powerful than the Jackals, but the ships in their fleet were actually too large to effectively operate inside the asteroid belt. The various Jackal factions banded together against the invaders and were able to use their home field advantage to make guerrilla attacks. Again, the Covenant felt compelled to offer a truce. The Jackals would join the Covenant, and many of their numbers would fill roles in the military. However, they would be granted some amount of autonomy to form and operate their own small fleets, to be used as scouts and couriers for the various Covenant ministries. It was made clear that should the opportunity present itself, pirate attacks on the Covenant enemies would be allowed or even encouraged. It might be surprising to find out that the Grunts are such a late addition to the Covenant, considering how often we see them. But they were not absorbed into the Empire until only 400 years before first contact with humanity. Their homeworld was environmentally unstable, and as a result, the Grunts were a relatively feeble and unhealthy species. They had not developed their own spaceflight, and didn't have any kind of meaningful defenses to be used against the Covenant invasion. They did not receive any kind of truce or treaty offering concessions in return for joining the Covenant. They were basically just enslaved and used as general laborers or unarmed cannon fodder in military engagements. Ironically, despite this poor treatment, being absorbed into the Covenant actually solved many of the Grunts' troubles with food, shelter, and medicine. Their population became healthier and their numbers grew quickly. This somewhat awkward turn of fortune actually convinced the Grunts that their discovery by the Covenant must have been divine intervention, and they became some of the most fervent adherents to the Covenant religion. Still, they were slaves, and they were treated as such. Eventually, this treatment became too much to handle, and the Grunts rebelled. It turns out that when properly motivated, the Grunts can raise some serious hell. Eventually, the Covenant leadership felt it necessary to assign an Arbiter to this crisis. Compared to the Arbiter who dealt with the Hunters, this Arbiter was not so patient. He almost immediately ordered the Grunts' home planet to be glassed. You can't argue with the effectiveness of the tactic though, as the Grunts surrendered once they saw their planet being destroyed. This loss again had a somewhat unexpected outcome for the Grunts. The elites were actually impressed by their show of strength, and many petitioned the Council to improve their position within the Covenant. While the Grunts remained the lowest caste in the hegemony, they were nonetheless made full citizens and given more resources and freedoms. Grunts serving in the military were now armed and trained, and some low-level positions in research and theology were opened up for the more intelligent members of their species. Over the next few centuries, there would be some other, smaller bouts of unrest among the Grunts, but by and large they became quite comfortable with their lot in life. And that will take us to within 40 years of the start of the Human-Covenant War, when the Covenant would first encounter the Brutes. They are a very recent addition to the Empire. The Brutes had previously achieved a high level of technology and even managed spaceflight, but then had managed to nuke themselves almost to death in a large war, destroying much of their infrastructure. At first contact, they were actually engaging in a new pre-industrial civil war among themselves. Much like the Grunts, they had no real means to defend themselves, but the difference is that they seemed very willing to go down fighting rather than be forcibly recruited. Still, the Prophets saw potential in their former society, and their combat abilities were obvious. They were offered the opportunity to join the Covenant and be given position in its military. A few prominent pack leaders were very eager to join and gain access to the kind of weapons and power that such a partnership would bring. With some of the Brutes on board, the remaining holdouts were quickly defeated and absorbed into the new Loyalist pack. But their place within the Covenant hierarchy was not a comfortable one. The Brutes were angry about having to serve under the elites, to the point of insisting on leading their own groups of Grunts, Jackals, and Drones. The elites disliked their savagery and felt that their pack mentality would lead to infighting to assert dominance. The High Council, being half made up of by elites, passed a number of restrictions on what kind of positions the Brutes could hold, and what technology and weapons they would have access to. Still, the Prophets found there was value in a military force that was less intelligent, and less interested in debating morality and honor. Especially after the start of the war with the humans, the Brutes found their responsibilities growing. There's one last member of the Covenant that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's kind of an interesting one as the Covenant themselves don't really consider them a member. The code for this species actually exists within Halo 1, although it was never used. These are the Engineers. The Prophets discovered the Engineers in a Forerunner facility before they even made contact with the elites. Their bodies are made up of buoyant sacs full of biologically refined gases, and they have long tentacles with a bunch of tiny hair-like fingers. But here's where it gets interesting. The Engineers were actually built by the Forerunner, made to be used as tools. They were bioengineered with the innate talent to repair technology and the desire to do nothing else. They are alive, they have individual names, a language, and they will reproduce to keep their numbers up. but they don't really have any concept of allegiances or religion, and have no will to be anywhere beyond where there are things to be fixed. So the Covenant confine them to the engine rooms on their ships, and the engineers will happily fix anything that may break. They are really more in the Covenant's possession rather than on the Covenant's side. And that is all the species that make up the Covenant. There is some implication that they encountered others, but that they were considered unworthy of joining, or potentially refused the offer to join, and either gave up their Forerunner artifacts willingly, or fought to the very end. However, as far as I know, the humans are the first people that the Covenant have been insistent on trying to eradicate, without ever giving them the opportunity to surrender or join. In any case, let's talk a bit about Arbiters. They've come up twice in this video already, and we know it's an important position from the player character in Halo 2, but the actual role itself is a little confusing. There's a whole mausoleum on High Charity to memorialize past Arbiters, and the position comes with a ceremonial set of armor. But at the same time, the title seems to be given as a punishment. So what exactly is an Arbiter? The role comes from the Elite's culture, and its origins go back long before they ever met the Prophets. Originally, they were sort of warrior kings, both political and military leaders of their clans. Not elected exactly, they were more appointed as needed by a sort of group consensus of the most worthy member. It was a great honor to be asked to take up the role. After the Elites joined the Covenant, many of their customs and traditions were lost. They continued to appoint Arbiters, but now as sort of a cultural leader, to be a representative of all the Elites, separate from the High Council. The position commanded a high level of respect within the Covenant, even among the Prophet hierarchs. However, several millennia after the formation of the Covenant, and only a few hundred years before the events of Halo, things would change. One Arbiter, an experienced and very well-respected Elite, had a crisis of conscience. He realized that while the Elites strived to conduct themselves honorably in combat, the actions of the Covenant as a whole were dishonorable. Using their overwhelming might to force other races into subservience beneath them could not be considered righteous. This line of thought would cascade into his religious beliefs as well. He had spent his entire life walking the path as dictated by the Prophets, but now recognized that they had never shared the source of their knowledge about the Great Journey. What if it was merely a lever used by the Prophets to control the other species of the Covenant? As he attempted to discuss this new perspective with his peers, he found that he was largely alone with his doubts. Eventually, the hierarchs would learn of this Arbiter's opinions, and he was brought before them and asked to reaffirm his belief in the Great Journey and his adherence to the path. But the Arbiter could not. He told the Prophets that he was now sure that the Great Journey was a lie. The hierarchs labeled him as a heretic. They picked another capable Elite and tasked him with assassinating the Arbiter. A large and messy battle would take place, resulting in the deaths of the Arbiter, as well as the Prophet's new champion. As a result of these events, the role of the Arbiter was completely changed. The title was no longer a source of pride, but a mark of shame. But being offered the position of Arbiter isn't exactly a punishment. It's more like a chance at redemption. A disgraced Elite may be given the opportunity to take up the mantle and wear the armor. By doing so, they give up their name and their previous life, and commit to being a tool of the Prophets. If the new Arbiter proves themselves useful and completes the tasks assigned to them, they may regain some amount of their lost honor, and possibly even prove themselves worthy again. These awkward circumstances lead to a sort of confusing balance of respect. We see in Halo 2 that the Arbiter is personally disrespected by others, but at the same time, his abilities and his worthiness as a chosen warrior are still recognized, especially among the other Elites. Perhaps in the right circumstances, this Arbiter really can regain his honor and show himself to be a righteous warrior befitting the ancient title.